The recording is on. That's ready to go. Okay. Good. Please tell us a bit about yourself and perhaps why you came up with this particular talk. Just for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll start with the talk proper.
Right. Well, thank you, Peter. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you. Those of us who work in history of pharmacy, very often the focus is very much around the link between pharmacy and medicine rather than pharmacy and chemistry. So I'm delighted to explore that area today. I've been working on the history of pharmacy around 30 or so years now, but I certainly didn't start as a pharmaceutical historian. My first degree was pharmacy. I did my pharmacy at Manchester. I did the 4-year degree course there and specialised in pharmaceutics. And pharmaceutics is the branch of pharmacy which is about turning drugs into medicines, in other words, developing suitable dosage forms and so on. And I started in industry. I worked for Beecham Research Laboratories down in Worthing, mainly around semi-synthetic penicillins, one or two other things, and worked there for, I think, about 4 years in the end, but decided my prospects might be rather better in hospital pharmacy. So I moved to North Wales, get some basic experience, and was very lucky very quickly to be appointed principal pharmacist at Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool. So I then had around 20 years working in hospital pharmacy. I moved to London in the late 70s to be chief pharmacist at the Westminster Hospital in London, before being appointed director of pharmacy at St George's down in Tooting, once all the various sites had merged. And I did that for a bit longer, but decided to make a switch again to being an academic. And I did that in the early 90s, moved to the School of Pharmacy, UCL School of Pharmacy, did a number of things, but got funding to do various studies in the history of pharmacy. So that's where I started with this. And at the beginning of 95, I moved to the School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, which is where the National Centre for the History in Public Health is, to work really under the direction of Virginia Berridge, who's Professor History of Medicine there. And basically, I've been there ever since. And my research interests, they started really around looking at the link between pharmacy policy and pharmacy practice. I did a big oral history study, around 50 community pharmacists, exploring that. So that was the first big study. There was another big funded study, which was the same for hospital pharmacy, interviewed around 50 practicing and retired hospital pharmacists, and then moved on to pharmacy's role in public health, various publications around that. But in the meantime, I had various teaching management roles and finished at the school as Associate Dean of Studies. And at that point, I got interested in the history of pharmacy and the impact British pharmacy had on the British Empire, basically. And that has resulted in 2 books fairly recently, one on professionalization of pharmacy in the British Empire, and more recently one on pharmacopoeias, drug regulation and empires. So this particular study has come out of many different strands of work. And as I say, as you expand your career, you extend both geographically and in time. And that takes us to the issues around how pharmacy was professionalized and its links with medicine and chemistry. So that's very much, Peter, where this particular talk has come from.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart, for that introduction, both to yourself and your topic. So, without further ado, I call upon Stuart to talk about pharmacy in Britain, division of medicine or the branch of chemistry. Stuart, over to you.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'll start with an outline of what I plan to do here. And really what I want to do is to trace the origins of the use of titles, certainly, but also particularly the connections between pharmacy and chemistry. And starting very briefly with spices, as they were called back in the 12th century. Early chemical discoveries had a major impact on pharmacy and strongly shaped the ambitions, certainly of the founders of the Pharmaceutical Society, which was founded in 1841. But throughout earlier centuries, pharmacy was considered a branch of medicine. However, by the late 18th century, many leading doctors were starting to regard pharmacy more as a branch of chemistry, whilst leading chemists and druggists were in no doubt that it was indeed a division of medicine. Well, although the Pharmaceutical Society was founded in 1841, just a few weeks after the Chemical Society of London, it took nearly 60 years for pharmacy to emerge as a single united profession, separate from both medicine and chemistry. Should have one. That's the one. Pharmacy in Britain as a profession evolved slowly after or over many centuries, from around the 11th century. Key landmarks included the foundation of the Society of Apothecaries in 1617. It was followed by an important legal case, the Rose case in 1704, then the Apothecaries Act of 1815, and finally the foundation of the Society itself in 41. And as you'll see, there are a few acts that specify the various titles later on. The earliest title used to describe someone engaged in the making or supplying of medicines was actually that of spicer. It was used certainly in 1181 and probably much earlier. The term apothecarius was first used for a monastic storekeeper, but the name apothecary acquired a pharmaceutical meaning first in France in the late 12th century. By the 13th century, the titles spicer, pepperer, and apothecary were all being used in England, along with combined titles such as spicer apothecary. Well, these descriptions overlapped and changed over time. The apothecary of the Middle Ages was very different to the apothecary of the 18th century. By the 14th century, the general term grocer, after supply by the gross, was applied to pepperers, spicers, and apothecaries. Pepperers were mainly wholesale dealers, mainly in port cities, and spicers were mainly retail sellers, mainly in the provinces. Those in London joined together in an early trade guild, later becoming part of the Grocers' Company, which received its royal charter in 1428. And this diagram also illustrates the eventual separation of medicine from pharmacy and the evolution of some alchemists into chemists and eventually pharmacists. Well, during the 15th and 16th centuries, the numbers and activities of apothecaries enlarged. And by the end of the 16th century, they represented a large and powerful group within the Grocers' Company. They petitioned the king to establish a separate guild, and in 1617, the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries was founded, still going. The king had hoped that the apothecaries and physicians would work together, but the 17th and 18th centuries were marked by continuous disputes between them over occupational boundaries, with the physicians accusing the apothecaries of practicing medicine and the apothecaries objecting to the physicians making and supplying their own medicines. Well, in Britain, the issue of who had the legal right to practice medicine and who to dispense medicines came to a head in 1704. In 1701, the Royal College of Physicians took out a summons against an apothecary, William Rose, for supplying medicines that had not been prescribed by a physician. The physicians initially won their case, but it went to appeal, and the House of Lords finally found in favour of Rose. They judged it to be in the public interest to allow apothecaries to advise patients as well as to supply medicines. The Rose case confirmed the right of apothecaries to practice medicine, including visiting the sick and prescribing remedies. But they could not charge for the services, only the medicines they prescribed. And it set apothecaries in Britain on the path of medical rather than pharmaceutical practice, unlike their colleagues across Europe. Well, chemist shops first appeared in London around the 16th century, when the title chemist was used to denote one who made and sold chemicals, although these early chemists often also made extracts and tinctures from plants. They competed with the apothecaries, who gradually evolved into two groups, one mainly involved in practicing medicine, the other more focused on pharmacy. Apothecaries operating from shops adopted titles including chemist, druggist, and pharmacopolist, a term dating from the time of Henry VIII. Those dealing in the retail sale of chemicals and plant medicines came to be called by the combined title of chemist and druggist, a title that survived into the middle of the 20th century. Well, like pharmacy, chemistry, of course, had ancient origins in the activities of alchemists and others. Alchemy was mainly practiced in the Middle East and in China, but whilst Egyptian, Persian, and Greek alchemists were mainly focused on transmuting base metals into gold, Chinese alchemists were more interested in discovering a pill of immortality. Western alchemists soon joined them in the search for this elixir of life. But in many parts of Europe, by the early 17th century, pharmacy and chemistry were recognized as separate and distinct activities. This frontispiece of a 1622 publication, Pharmacotheca, meaning drug chest, shows the apothecary with his mortar and the chemist with his distillation apparatus, united in their efforts to provide medicines for the world. Old distinctions between traditional Galenic therapeutics, based mainly on herbal medicines, and the newer Paracelsian remedies based on chemical preparations were beginning to break down. Well, the publication of Robert Boyle's The Sceptical Chemist in 1661 was an important landmark in both chemistry and pharmacy. Boyle's rebuttal of the theory of the four elements, fire, earth, air, and water, and his suggestion that an element was a substance which could not be broken down into simpler ones, also had a profound impact on medicine. The increased interest in chemical remedies led to the appointment by Charles II in the 1660s of Nicasius Lefebvre as the chemical professor and apothecary in ordinary, and his successors later usually took the title chemist in ordinary. Well, as increasing numbers of apothecaries practiced medicine rather than pharmacy in the 18th century, often practicing surgery as well, apothecaries' shops were usually taken on by unqualified chemists and druggists. Their numbers increased rapidly, especially after 1780. By the end of the 18th century, chemists and druggists had emerged as a distinct branch of the medical profession. Shop-based apothecaries were seen as quite distinct from the laboratory-based chemists, as depicted here in the Book of English Trades. But a dispute then arose between apothecaries who operated pharmaceutical businesses and the chemists and druggists, the apothecaries accusing the chemists and druggists of encroaching on their turf by selling medicines and dispensing physicians' prescriptions. So by the early 19th century, there were a great variety of individuals practicing medicine in one form or another, and a large number of bodies claiming to represent them. Some began lobbying Parliament for medical reform. This was a long process that finally ended with passage of the Medical Act in 1858. But discussions continued for years, and they were interspersed with a number of acts of Parliament, one of the first being this, the Apothecaries Act of 1815. The apothecaries had applied to Parliament for support, and an act was passed which gave them powers to act against unqualified persons who engaged in the diagnosis of disease and the supply of medicines. This, not surprisingly, was vehemently opposed by the chemists and druggists, and the apothecaries agreed to a clause making all persons already engaged in the business of chemists and druggists exempt. Well, the latter group, the chemists and druggists, did not agree, and they drafted a bill of their own. But the Apothecaries Act, along with the exemptions they'd agreed, was passed regardless. So by this act, the Society of Apothecaries became responsible for about 2/3 of all medical practitioners. Indeed, all those not members of one of the colleges of physicians. A court decision in 1829 made it legal for apothecaries to charge for their skill and attendance. The added clause allowed chemists and druggists to continue their trade in the buying, preparing, dispensing, and vending of drugs, wholesale and retail, as it was before the passing of this act. It gave them legal authority to practice pharmacy without any requirements regarding education or even apprenticeship. In addition, the Society of Apothecaries' powers to inspect shops and drugs did not extend to chemists and druggists. Well, despite all the ongoing disputes between the physicians, the apothecaries, and the chemists and druggists, they were all generally agreed that they were in fact all practicing medicine or physic in one form or another. In his 1747 book, The London Tradesman, Robert Campbell described the profession of physic in all its branches, i.e. the physician, surgeon, chemist, druggist, and apothecary. And even after passage of the Apothecaries Act, Mr. Justice Park declared in 1828 that the object of the Act had been to keep the business of apothecary distinct from the other branches of the profession. But he saw 4 degrees in the medical profession: physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, and chemists and druggists. Each is protected in his own branch, he declared, and neither must interfere with the province of the other. Well, 4 of the 9 bills introduced into Parliament for the regulation of the medical profession between 1840 and 1850 included chemists and druggists. Jacob Bell, the eventual founder of the Pharmaceutical Society, wrote about the position which pharmacy occupies, or ought to occupy, as a branch of the medical profession. He wrote, We have always maintained that our body is and must be considered a branch of the medical profession, and whatever regulations respecting education, registration, or protection may be considered necessary for medical practitioners, the same or similar enactments are no less requisite in our department. But the enormous impact of chemistry on pharmacy was already clear to everyone. The importance of a chemical education became increasingly obvious to certainly leading chemists and druggists, who recognized that education needed to be the foundation of any attempt to professionalize pharmacy. Some chemical chemists then began to see pharmacy as a subdivision of chemistry, and therefore that pharmacists should be subordinate to chemists. This idea gained a strong foothold, particularly in France, where the chemist Antoine François Fourcroy, a contemporary of Lavoisier, asserted that pharmacists needed to recognize the position of pharmacy as subordinate to chemistry and to fully acquaint themselves with all new discoveries. While this idea that pharmacy was little more than a subdivision of chemistry was taken up by leading physicians in England, Anthony Todd Thomson had graduated as a Doctor of Medicine at Edinburgh in 1799, becoming a member of the Royal Medical Society in the same year. In 1828, he became Professor of Materia Medica and Therapeutics at the University of London. But he was the author of the widely used London Dispensatory, first published in 1811. In part 1, he spells out the relation between pharmacy and chemistry. Pharmacy, he says, is that branch of the science of chemistry which relates to the combination and mixture of different substances for the purposes of medicine. Its practices supposes a knowledge of the ultimate principles of the substances it employs in its operations and of their chemical agencies, and hence of the general doctrines of chemical science. The elements of pharmacy, therefore, properly speaking, are those of chemistry, and without knowledge of these, it cannot either theoretically be understood or advantageously practiced as an art. Well, following Thomson's lead, many physicians in the early 19th century viewed chemistry as a branch of medicine and pharmacy as a branch of chemistry. Both were widely taught in medical schools and few other places. Before 1841, chemists and druggists mainly learnt their trade through apprenticeship. Very few attended classes in chemistry or any other subject. For pharmacy, there were no examinations to take and no qualifications to acquire. It was doctors, not chemists and druggists, who were the people most informed about pharmaceutical chemistry. Well, the beginnings of modern pharmacy and its transformation from an art into a science are often traced to the first isolations of active components of plant medicines in the early 19th century. In 1806, the German pharmacist Friedrich Sertner isolated morphine from opium, and he went on to conduct experiments in his apothecary shop, including a series of tests on himself and his friends, illustrated here, and he discovered a wide range of alkaloids. In 1817, the French pharmacist Pierre-Joseph Pelletier discovered the emetic substance in ipecacuanha, which he named emetine, and he went on to discover other active compounds extracted from plants, including caffeine and strychnine. And in 1820, Pelletier and Caventou extracted quinine and cinchonine from cinchona bark, and thereafter large numbers of active constituents were isolated from plants. Well, these discoveries had an important impact on both pharmacy and chemistry. Textbooks of chemistry appeared, including the first edition of Brand's Manual of Chemistry in 1819. William Thomas Brand was the son of the Queen's apothecary, and he became an apprentice apothecary himself in 1802. But like many apothecaries, he went on to study medicine, first at the London Medical School and also at St George's Hospital. But his interests moved towards chemistry after meeting with Humphrey Davy. The boundaries between medicine, pharmacy, chemistry, and indeed botany were all rather ill-defined and porous at the time. And indeed, early professors of botany at Oxford and chemistry at Cambridge often had either a medical or pharmaceutical background. But despite the central importance of chemistry to the development of pharmacy, the elite group of London chemists and druggists and former apothecaries who founded the Pharmaceutical Society saw themselves not as a branch of chemistry, but as pioneers of a new scientific discipline under the medical umbrella. Their commitment to science led to an emphasis on education, examination, qualification, and registration. Dependence on crude drugs of unknown and variable composition would end, and pure compounds would allow more accurate dosage. And Bell had this to say about chemistry in 1841. Pharmacy in the present day embraces so many sciences and has become so complicated from the discoveries which have recently been made, especially in chemistry, that a complete knowledge of the subject can only be acquired by those who devote their exclusive attention to the pursuit. The science of chemistry is alone sufficiently comprehensive to engage the whole time of those who are desirous of becoming acquainted with all its details. The principles of chemistry should be understood by every person who undertakes to prepare a prescription. And in many of the daily operations of pharmacy, a profound knowledge of the science is indispensable. Well, of course, pharmacists were not alone in seeking recognition and respectability. By 1840, there were already 41 scientific, literary, and other societies in London alone, with a total membership exceeding 17,000. There were 2 for astronomy and 7 for natural history. And both the chemical chemists and the pharmaceutical chemists formed societies in 1841. The chemical chemists were the first by a few weeks, and there was considerable cross-membership between the two. On the 23rd of February 1841, 25 men met at the Society of Arts and agreed to form the Chemical Society of London. And that was inaugurated on the 30th of March, when 77 invited scientists, which included doctors, academics, and manufacturers, formed its founding members. And its first secretary was Robert Warrington, this gentleman, who was the chemist at the time to the Society of Apothecaries Laboratory between 1842 and 1866. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1864, and it was he who wrote the account of the founding of the Chemical Society in 1896. And when in 1848 Queen Victoria granted the Chemical Society a royal charter, its purpose was confirmed as the general advancement of chemical science. Focuses on the science rather than the people. Its president in 1849-51 was Richard Phillips, and he's a key figure later involved in translating and editing the British Pharmacopoeia, the Book of Standards for Medicines, first published in 1864. Well, one of the many bills intended to amend the law relating to the medical profession was introduced into the House of Commons on the 5th of February 1841. It was an attempt to reform the whole medical profession, including the chemists and druggists. Anyone practicing medicine would need to be registered as a medical practitioner. So if a chemist and druggist recommended a dose of rhubarb or dressed a cut finger, he would be judged to be practicing medicine and he would be prosecuted. So a small group of chemists and druggists met to discuss how to respond, and a public meeting was called for on the 15th of February at the Crown and Anchor Tavern in the Strand. Well, on the 19th of February, just 2 weeks later, the bill was withdrawn. But in March, the Royal College of Physicians revealed its plans, in cooperation with the Society of Apothecaries, to compel chemists and druggists to take their qualifying examination. Leading chemists and druggists met at Jacob Bell's house, after which a public meeting was convened, again at the Crown and Anchor, on the 15th of April, 1841. William Allen proposed that an association be now formed under the title of the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, whose purpose would be to protect the permanent interests and increase the respectability of chemists and druggists about people. Well, by September 1841, the Pharmaceutical Society already had 450 members and associates. By the end of December the same year, it had reached 800, and by May 1842, it had risen to around 2,000. Membership of the Chemical Society, on the other hand, grew much more slowly. Its initial membership of 77 had grown to 185 5 years later, by 1846, and had reached just 323 by 1860. The Pharmaceutical Society set up its headquarters in Bloomsbury Square, and a year later, 1842, it opened its School of Pharmacy, complete with its own laboratory. This was modelled on that of Liebig's at Gessen, and students studied quantitative and qualitative analysis using known compounds, and they went on to produce pure substances from raw materials. And this model formed the basis of much pharmacy education that followed. Chemistry then was to be the foundation of the education for this new class of pharmaceutical chemists, although initially this title, pharmaceutical chemist, was granted only to pharmacy proprietors. There were close personal links between those involved in professionalizing pharmacy and doing the same for chemistry. 6 members of the Pharmaceutical Society had also been founder members of the Chemical Society: Jacob Bell, Theophilus Redwood, and Jonathan Pereira, first professor of Materia Medica at the Pharmaceutical Society School, had all joined the Chemical Society. Well, a number of people continued to express the view that pharmacy should be regarded simply as a branch of the science of chemistry, and one of these was John Lloyd Bullock, who practiced as a chemist and druggist in Mayfair. In 1843, he and an apothecary, John Gardner, proposed setting up a practical chemistry school as an annex to the Royal Institution. It would have 2 parts. The first would be devoted to pure science and be part of the Royal Institution, and the second would be devoted to applied chemistry and would be placed in premises owned by Bullock. Well, this initiative resulted in the foundation of the Royal College of Chemistry in October 1845, which would be an independent, privately funded institution for the promotion of chemistry and its applications. And the government assumed responsibility for its funding later in 1853. Well, when the Chemical Society was founded in 1841, the Society of Apothecaries had no objections to it at all. But the Pharmaceutical Society was seen as a major threat, as it would be a new examining body. The Society of Apothecaries pressed for itself to be the examining body for the chemists and druggists, who would thus become subordinate to it. They supported better education for chemists and druggists, but not the formation of a new society, which they judged to be both unnecessary and highly objectionable. They renamed their own awards in Materia Medica and Therapeutics as Materia Medica and Pharmaceutical Chemistry, and successfully prosecuted a chemist and druggist in St. Helens for practicing as an apothecary. In 1851, they reinforced their position against the chemists and druggists by opposing a planned new pharmacy bill. Well, the Pharmaceutical Society later took its revenge by excluding licentiates of the Society of Apothecaries from its own membership. Well, Jacob Bell had believed that pharmacy should be considered as a distinct branch of the science of medicine. In 1841, he made an attempt to get pharmacy admitted to the medical section of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, but his application was unsuccessful. Bullock and others continued to see pharmacy as a branch of the science of chemistry. The status of the pharmaceutical chemist should, he believed, be linked to that of other professional scientists, and it should no longer be constrained by medical hierarchies. Yet both Bell and Bullock recognized that chemistry provided the scientific basis that would help pharmacy to gain the status of a profession rather than a trade. Well, having established its own school in 1842, the Pharmaceutical Society was anxious to establish a specifically pharmaceutical science. It was soon at loggerheads with the College of Chemistry. Jacob Bell wanted to distinguish the curriculum of the School of Pharmacy from that of the College of Chemistry, where, he suggested, many of the researchers were rather calculated to divert the mind of the druggist from his own legitimate sphere. Insults and abuse were exchanged in the pages of the Chemist and the Pharmaceutical Journal. Bullock and others objected to the fact the Pharmaceutical Society opened its doors to persons with no other qualification than the payment of its exorbitant annual demand. The Chemical Society, on the other hand, was a scholarly body for the advancement of chemical science. Well, it was passage of the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act in 1860 that generated a new demand for people with skills in chemical analysis and creating the role of the office of public analyst. But such people were in short supply. They had varying qualifications and they often reached conflicting decisions. Their duties increased with passage of the 1872 Food and Drugs Act, which incorporated the 1868 Pharmacy Act in full. Education was crucial, and the Select Committee in 1874 recommended that local government boards require analysts to obtain a certificate of competence from the School of Chemistry. Well, in the same year, 27 public analysts, including some physicians and academics, met under the chairmanship of Theophilus Redwood, the professor of pharmacy at the Pharmaceutical Society, no less, following an invitation from two prominent London public analysts. Redwood had himself been appointed as the public analyst for Middlesex, and he remained a public analyst until his own death in 1892. The group agreed to form a new society to be called the Society of Public Analysts, with Redwood being elected as its first president in 1874. The society was founded to refute unjust imputation and to repudiate the proposed measures of interference with our professional position and independence. But it was much more than a mutual defence association. It opposed plans to make the Inland Revenue Laboratory the court of reference for disputed cases. It drafted definitions for adulteration, and it set standards. And when the new Sale of Food and Drugs Act was passed in 1875, the qualifications of analysts were spelled out, and public analysts became a restricted title. The Society of Public Analysts became the Society for Analytical Chemistry in 1907. Well, for Jacob Bell, the way forward for pharmacy was to obtain legal incorporation by obtaining a royal charter and then to secure an Act of Parliament giving pharmaceutical chemists certain privileges. The royal charter was granted in 1843. This gave the society authority and status, and it also conferred it with a certain moral authority over all chemists and druggists, not just the pharmaceutical chemists and pharmacy proprietors. Getting an act passed took a little longer. By 1846, it was clear that the government had no intention of including pharmacy in any medical reform bill. So, unable to find an MP to take on a pharmacy bill, Bell became a member of Parliament himself. And in 1850, he worked to secure passage of the Pharmacy Act. And it was passed 2 years later in 1852. Well, the 1852 Pharmacy Act gave the Society the task of maintaining a register of pharmaceutical chemists. So to the role of education provider, examining board, and representative body, it added that of registration authority. And the titles pharmaceutical chemist and pharmaceutist were reserved for its members, along with those who passed its higher level or major examination. But at this stage, the title chemist and druggist was not restricted, and anyone could set themselves up in business without any training. The Act allowed chemists and druggists already in business to register with the society, but not to use the title pharmaceutical chemist. However, only 800 of the over 5,000 in business at the time chose to do so. Most chemists and druggists were much more interested in trade than in either science or becoming a profession. Well, by the mid-1850s, Parliament had finally settled on its plans for medical reform, and in 1858, the Medical Act was passed, 43 years after the Apothecaries Act. And this created the General Medical Council, and it established a single register for all medical practitioners. It was a register in 3 parts, one for physicians, one for surgeons, and one for general medical practitioners, who were including many of the former apothecaries. But there was no 4th register for pharmacists, since passage of the 1852 Pharmacy Act meant that a statutory register already existed for pharmaceutical chemists, although, of course, it excluded chemists and druggists. Well, this rift between the pharmaceutical chemists, who emphasise pharmacy as profession and science, and the chemists and druggists, who focus much more on pharmacy as trade and business, continued for over half a century. A new trade journal, The Chemist and Druggist, appeared in 1859, and a year later it carried the prospectus for a new society, the United Society of Chemists and Druggists. But in 1864, the Pharmaceutical Society planned a new pharmacy bill to strengthen its own members, but still firmly excluding the chemists and druggists. The United Society submitted its own bill, which included proposals to link professional regulation with the control of poisons, then a matter of some public concern. Well, both draft bills were considered by the Select Committee, who noted favourably the United Society's bill linking the regulation of pharmacy with the control of poisons, but rejected both and requested that a joint one be provided. And the new Act, the 1868 Pharmacy and Poisons Act, retained the distinction between pharmaceutical chemists, who now required to pass the examinations for the major qualification, and the chemists and druggists, who were required to pass the minor examination. But the restricted titles, chemist, druggist, chemist and druggist, pharmacist, dispensing chemist, and dispensing druggist, were all added to the list already included in the earlier Act. So you may be wondering at this stage how it is that chemical chemists can actually call themselves chemists at all, given that chemist is a restricted title under the Pharmacy Act. Well, the answer to that is that an individual who was not a registered pharmacist, such as an analytical chemist, could indeed use the description chemist, provided that it was not used in connection with the sale of goods by retail. Well, being explicitly barred from engaging in retail trade has, I think, been a real asset to chemical chemists. It strengthened their commitment to science and professional status, and to their recognition as professionals in society. But for pharmaceutical chemists, on the other hand, the association with trade has been a very heavy burden, and indeed continues to be a major obstacle to pharmacists being recognised as health professionals by the public, rather than just as another shop on the high street. Well, restriction of titles was, nevertheless, a considerable commercial asset. Unqualified drug sellers were forced to use other titles, such as herbalist or medical botanist. And the Pharmaceutical Society took a very hard line on infringements, considering that unqualified persons were barred from using not only the listed titles, but also any name or title that suggested or implied registration with them. And the courts invariably agreed. In the 1870s, the societies obtained two important rulings in Scotland. In the first, the defendant was a highly qualified chemist, but he was not registered as a chemist with the Pharmaceutical Society. In his advertisements and his catalogue, he described himself as a scientific instrument maker and a technical chemist. He was prosecuted and held to have contravened the Act by using the name chemist. And in the second case, the defendant was a dealer in photographic requisites. He had over his shop a sign describing himself as a photographic chemist. The courts found that he was engaged in the sale of goods by retail, and since he was not registered with the society, ruled that he had infringed the 1868 Act. In England, the Society prosecuted unqualified persons for using a very wide range of other titles, including botanic chemist, shipping druggist, and indeed analytical chemist. Well, the situation changed following another legal case in 1878. Growing prosperity had led to the emergence of department stores and co-ops. In 1868, the Act had referred only to persons, stating that any person keeping open shop for the retailing, dispensing, or compounding of poisons without being duty qualified would be liable to prosecution. But the Act did not mention companies, and the legal arguments began over whether person could in law include a company. In 1878, the Pharmaceutical Society prosecuted the unqualified owner of a department store, the London and Provincial Supply Association on Tottenham Court Road, for supplying a poison. But it was in fact sold from the in-store pharmacy, which employed 3 qualified pharmacists. The case was appealed to the House of Lords, who in 1880 ruled that the companies owned by unqualified persons could indeed own pharmacies, provided the sale of medicines and poisons was under the control of a pharmacist. And it opened the floodgates to pharmacy chains or multiples, which developed very rapidly. Well, one of the first to do so was Jesse Boot, who was an unqualified herbalist in Nottingham. From his one shop, he expanded rapidly, and by 1900, he'd already opened 181 stores nationwide, usually under the banner Boots Cash Chemists. The word pharmacy, however, itself was not then restricted, and it had become popular amongst unregistered practitioners to describe a shop where medicines were sold, although other described theirs as drugstores or medical halls. But the word chemist was restricted, and Boot argued that while titles such as pharmaceutical chemist and pharmacist should indeed be reserved for holders of professional qualifications, the words chemist and druggist traditionally described a type of business and should be available for all those engaged in it. Well, the pharmacy registers continue to distinguish between those holding the major qualification and entitled to call themselves pharmaceutical chemists and those holding the minor qualification who are only able to call themselves chemists and druggists. The division between the two groups continued until 1898. But by then, by the mid-1880s, the Pharmaceutical Society's finances were in a bad way, and they needed to recruit new members. So a Pharmacy Acts Amendment Act was passed in 1898, which finally gave all chemists and druggists the right to become full members of the Pharmaceutical Society. Only then could all pharmacy practitioners be described as pharmacists. But some differences were retained. Only pharmaceutical chemists were exempt from jury service. The two registers were finally unified in 1954, when the more highly qualified pharmaceutical chemists were automatically made fellows of the Pharmaceutical Society. Further consolidation and legal protection of titles was given in the 1908 Act. The Lords agreed that companies could not only keep open shop for the sale of poisons, but they could also assume protected titles for their businesses. Use of the descriptions chemist and druggist, and dispensing chemist as business titles for pharmaceutical companies was legalized. Owners could also use the description pharmacy provided the premises were a registered and authorised seller of poison, but they were forbidden from using it if calculated to suggest that both the owner and manager were pharmacists when they were not. However, corporate bodies were forbidden from using the titles pharmaceutical chemist, pharmaceutist, or pharmacist, which were all designated as personal titles only. So to conclude, today, titles, emblems, and descriptions that could be construed as inferring that the person conducting the business possesses a qualification to sell, dispense, or compound drugs or poisons are still prohibited. Pharmacy remains a restricted title, and prosecutions continue to be pursued, most notably in recent years against Damien Hirst for his opening of a restaurant under the name Pharmacy in 1998. The Pharmaceutical Society took legal action against him, as by then, under the Medicines Act 1968, it had stated that no person shall, in connection with a business carried on by him, which consists of or includes the retail sale of any goods or the supply of any goods in circumstances corresponding to retail sale, use the description pharmacy, except in respect of a registered pharmacy or in respect of the pharmaceutical department of a hospital or a health centre. Well, following legal threats, the restaurant was renamed Army Chap, which is an anagram of pharmacy, before Hirst settled on pharmacy, restaurant, and bar, with restaurant and bar in very small letters. The society was advised that this just about satisfied the law, and the case was dropped. The restaurant itself closed in 2003, having run into financial difficulties. So when is a chemist not a chemist? Well, pharmaceutical chemists can still call themselves chemists at any time, including when involved in the sale of goods by retail. Chemical chemists, on the other hand, can call themselves chemists at any time, but except when engaged in the sale of goods by retail. So, as long as we're all not attempting to deliberately mislead a gullible public, I think most of us are reasonably safe from the long arm of the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for a very interesting talk with much fascinating detail. I have a couple of questions here, both from Diana Leach, but before I get on to that, I have a couple of questions myself. The first one is, briefly, because I'm aware that we're quite short of time now, but very briefly, how did the development of pharmacy in Britain differ from that in Europe? I mean, you alluded to this, but you didn't really go into it in any detail, which is quite understandable. But I just wondered, given all the convolution and combinations involved in Britain, it seems to have been generally much simpler in Europe.
Yes, the British situation was completely different from anywhere else in Europe. Basically, what happened elsewhere is that the apothecaries made a smooth transition from practicing pharmacy to become the pharmacist. So there was no movement in Europe from apothecaries choosing to practice medicine and to split, basically. So in the UK, we had this split of most apothecaries choosing to become general medical practitioners, which is what they did. That did not happen in Europe. And historians have argued that that set the history of pharmacy in the UK back something like 150 years because of that division. So that's the quick answer.
Okay. And that raises in itself a second question, which is related. Why do we have this trained British, and I think it is only British, you don't even get it in the United States where they speak English of a sort, where people, at least very recently, have always thought of pharmacists as being chemists. Now, I know you've gone into the whole chemist and druggist business and the distinction from pharmacists, but why has there been this almost universal assumption in Britain that pharmacists were chemists? I've never understood it.
The I think it goes back the centuries, doesn't it? You know, it's the going back to the, where are we, 16th century or whatever. The chemists, that title was being applied to people who were selling and making medicines, rather than, you know, just working away in their laboratory. So it's public face, isn't it, of an involvement in trade that we get in British pharmacy and chemistry, which perhaps we don't see elsewhere in Europe. And I think once that has started happening, it just carries on from one century to the next, doesn't it? I mean, I have to say, you know, the pharmacy profession has been attempting to persuade the public to call pharmacy pharmacy and pharmacists pharmacists, really from the beginning of the 20th century. And, you know, the fact that they're still being called chemists now, you know, represents a failure of persuading the public, doesn't it, really? I think that's what it amounts to. I think if you ask pharmacists, they say, no, you know, don't call me a chemist, I'm a pharmacist. It's the public who are choosing to call pharmacists chemists, not the chemists themselves.
Yeah, that makes it all the more stranger to me. But anyway, let's move on. Just very, very quickly, because again, I'm aware we're short of time. Why was it boot the cash chemist? I mean, what was the cash involved? Was it because they took money? But then surely all chemists and druggists took money. I don't understand why they were called cash chemists.
That's basically because a lot of chemists had accounts with the public, basically. And that's how the apothecaries tended to operate. You know, most of the apothecaries who had shops had accounts with either the doctors or the patients or whatever. Boots's innovation was, no, this is cash on the nail, as it were. But the benefit was much reduced prices. And that's the selling point. You know, his approach was stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap, and that's how it all took off, really.
Anyway, I should allow Diana Lee to ask her question because she asked it before me. She said I should explain that my husband is a fourth generation pharmacist, 3 generations in Scotland and 1 here in Manchester. The first one was a chemist and druggist in Glasgow. And here is the question. The question is there a distinction between what happened in England and in Scotland? Now, from my work on Roscoe, I know there was a distinction between Ireland and England because the Irish Pharmacy Act got through and Roscoe's English one didn't. But is there a distinction between Scotland and England here?
The short answer is there were minor differences between the two, because the Scots were always anxious to do things their own way, and definitely not in the same way as England, and particularly London. You know, and that's very much the origin of the Edinburgh pharmacopoeia as opposed to the London pharmacopoeia. There's differences there. But the differences rather different across the centuries. And you may be thinking that, one of the differences is what the doctors could do or couldn't do in Scotland versus England, because certainly in the 20th century, I think the doctors were, I've got to get this the right way around. They were, because much more a rural community, able to do a lot more dispensing than they were in England and Wales. So the roles were affected by that, sort of, just who's doing what, who's got the most of the business, if you like, for supplying over-the-counter medicines versus dispensing the prescriptions. So that there are differences there as well.
Okay. Diana also had a Manchester connection here because she said, I'm delighted to hear a Manchester pharmacy graduate speaking. Were you working with John Collett in pharmaceutics?
Yes, I was around in John's day, but the people I work closely, because you do an entire year just of pharmaceutics at the end, and it was, trying to remember their names now, but it was very much on the pharmaceutical microbiology side, as well as the formulation side. So yes, I do indeed remember John Collett, and I've seen him from time to time over the years as well. He's gone now, of course.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stuart, for that very interesting talk indeed, and thank you everybody for attending today. We had up to 50, declined a bit since people have now left, but we got up to 53, which is an extremely respectable number. And please, can I invite you all to come back again on the third Tuesday of next month, same time, 2 o'clock, when we'll be hearing a speaker from across the water, because John Powers from the United States will be talking about the cult of Priestley in the American Chemical Society in the 19th century. So please join us for that next month, third Tuesday, 2 o'clock. So I hope to see you all again. And thank you very much, Stuart, for your coming along and giving us such an interesting talk about chemists and pharmacists. I never realized I couldn't sell things under the title of chemist, so I've been warned. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye for now.